The air at the Miller estate auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of diesel exhaust, stale coffee, and the quiet desperation of a family selling off a lifetime. It was the fall of '78, and the mood in farming was electric, cocky even. Grain prices were strong, land values were shooting for the moon, and the banks were practically giving money away. I was there for a set of used cultivator sweeps for my old John Deere 4020, nothing more. A man who owns his land and his equipment outright learns to be frugal. My father, who'd seen the Dust Bowl turn good men to beggars, had burned that lesson into me like a brand. That's when Richard Davies rolled up. He wasn't driving his pickup. He was driving his brand new Steiger Panther Third, the big green one with the Cummins engine. He didn't park it with the other tractors. He drove it right up to the edge of the crowd, leaving the engine at a low, throbbing idle that vibrated right through the soles of your boots. It was a statement. Rich was all about statements. He swung down from the climate-controlled cab, not a speck of dust on his new Wrangler jeans. He saw me standing by a flatbed trailer piled with rusty tools. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face. "Jedediah," he said, his voice loud enough for a dozen other farmers to hear. "Looking for some spare parts for that museum piece of yours?" He was talking about my big bud. My KT450, a monster of a machine, built tough as a locomotive up in Havre, Montana. I'd bought it used from a big outfit in the Dakotas 5 years prior, hauled it down piece by piece, and spent a whole winter rebuilding the big Cummins inline-6 engine myself. It wasn't pretty. The original white paint was faded and chipped, showing the primer and even bare steel in places. The cab was basic, just a seat, a forest of levers, and more gauges than a B-17 bomber. No radio, no air conditioning. In the summer, you baked. In the winter, you froze. But when you throttled up that 450 horsepower engine and dropped the 40-foot chisel plow into the soil, you felt the raw, unadulterated power of the earth in your hands. And the best part? It was mine. Every last nut and bolt was paid for. "She still runs, Rich," I said, keeping my voice even. "Doesn't ask for much but fuel and grease." "Fuel, I bet," he scoffed, gesturing back at his Steiger. "This baby here's got all the new fuel-saver tech. I can work a quarter section on what that old two-stroke Detroit of yours would burn just warming up." He was wrong, of course. My Cummins wasn't a two-stroke, but correcting Rich in front of an audience was like trying to teach a pig to sing. It wasted your time and annoyed the pig. His new fleet was the talk of the county. He'd traded in his whole line of perfectly good International Harvester, 1060S6 and 1460S6, for all new green and yellow paint, a pair of 4640s with the sound guard bodies, that big Steiger for the heavy tillage, and a brand new 7720 turbo combine that looked more like a spaceship than a piece of farm equipment. He'd bought the old Henderson place, another 800 acres, leveraging his existing land to the hilt. The bankers loved him. They paraded him around like a prize bull. He was the future. "The bank's been good to me, Jed," he continued, polishing an imaginary scuff on his boot. "They know you got to spend money to make money. This isn't the 1930s anymore. You can't get ahead running 30-year-old iron." He was talking about my 4020, my rock, my go-to tractor for planting and cultivating. It was a 68, one of the last of the good ones before they changed the styling. That side console diesel was the sweetest running engine Deere ever made, in my opinion. I could tear it down and put it back together blindfolded. It didn't have a cab, just fenders and a sun-bleached umbrella. On a hot June day, cultivating corn, you ate a pound of dust and smelled the rich, black Iowa soil baking in the sun. You felt connected to it. Rich, sealed in his air-conditioned cab listening to the radio, was just a pilot flying over the landscape. The auctioneer started his chatter, but Rich wasn't done with me. "You know, my banker was asking about you the other day. Said he hasn't seen you in for a loan in years." I told him, "Jedstone? He's probably still got the first dollar he ever earned, stuffed in a mason jar under his floorboards." The men around us chuckled. I just looked at him. "My father taught me that the bank is a tool, Rich, not a partner. You use it, you don't let it use you. When you owe the bank, your name might be on the deed, but their name is on your soul." Rich just shook his head, a pitying look on his face. "You're a dinosaur, Jed. You and that big bud of yours. You'll both be extinct in 5 years. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was supposed to look friendly, but felt like a shove. Then he walked off to go talk to the banker, who was standing by the food truck, both of them laughing. I stayed and bought my cultivator sweeps for $10. As I loaded them into the back of my rusty '68 Ford F100, I watched Rich's new Steiger rumble away, leaving deep, arrogant tracks in the gravel. Everyone saw him as a success story, a model of modern agriculture. They saw me as a stubborn old fool, clinging to the past. They saw my paid-for machinery as a liability and his mountain of debt as an asset. The world had gone crazy. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what happened next, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man who refused to go into debt, even when everyone else was getting rich on the bank's money? Maybe it was your father or your grandfather, a man who valued a clear ledger more than a new tractor. Let me know in the comments below, because Jedediah Stone was that man, and in the fall of 1978, it was a lonely, lonely road to walk. The following spring proved Rich's point, or so it seemed to everyone else. The winter had been hard, with a deep freeze that lingered into March. When the ground finally thawed, it was a mad dash to get the crops in. I fired up the big bud to start the primary tillage, and the big Cummins roared to life as always, black smoke billowing from the tall chrome stack before settling into a steady, rhythmic thrum. I let it warm up for a good 20 minutes, checking the fluids, walking around it, feeling the heat start to radiate from the massive engine block. Everything seemed fine. I put it in gear, eased out the clutch, and pulled the 30-foot disc into the field. The tractor didn't even grunt. It was pure, raw power. For 3 days I worked from sunup to sundown, turning over the rich black soil of my 200 acres. The smell of diesel and damp earth was the smell of creation itself. Then, on the 4th day, it happened. I was on my last pass in the north quarter when I felt a lurch, followed by a high-pitched whine from the transmission that cut right through the engine's roar. I immediately pushed in the clutch and pulled the throttle back. The whine died down but didn't disappear. It sounded like a bearing screaming for its life. I knew, with the cold certainty that every farmer dreads, that I was dead in the water. The Fuller 9-speed transmission, a gearbox built for a semi-truck, had given up the ghost. Getting that tractor back to the farmstead was a nightmare. I had to unhitch the disc in the field and limp the bud back in first gear, the whine growing with every rotation of the tires. It took me an hour to go half a mile. I parked it on the concrete floor of my machine shed, the big doors groaning as I slid them open. The silence that fell when I shut off the engine was deafening. The smell of burnt gear oil was thick in the air. My planting season had just come to a screeching halt. News travels fast in a small town. The next morning, as I was draining the transmission fluid, a thick metallic sludge that confirmed my worst fears. Rich Davies drove by. Not in his pickup, but in his new John Deere 4640, pulling a 24-row planter. He was already putting seed in the ground. He slowed as he passed my lane, the clean hiss of his turbo, a stark contrast to the silence in my shed. He didn't wave. He just looked, a smug expression on his face, before accelerating away, leaving a cloud of dust. The message was clear. This is what happens to dinosaurs. The guys at the Napa Auto Parts store in town weren't much better. A Fuller Road Ranger, out of a big bud? The man behind the counter, a guy I'd gone to high school with, whistled through his teeth. "Jed, we ain't gonna have parts for that on hand. I can try to order a rebuild kit, but it'll have to come out of Des Moines, or maybe even further. Could take a week. Maybe 2. 2 weeks, in the middle of planting season. 2 weeks was an eternity. Every day you weren't in the field was a day of lost yield, of lost opportunity. Just get it coming, I told him, my jaw tight. Back at the farm, the real work began. That transmission was the size of a hogshead barrel and weighed the better part of a ton. I didn't have a modern hydraulic lift. I had an old engine hoist and a set of heavy-duty chain falls I'd rigged to a steel I-beam in the rafters of my shed. For the next 3 days, I wrestled with that greasy iron beast. It was a symphony of grunts, curses, and the sharp clang of a wrench slipping off a tight bolt. I soaked every nut in penetrating oil, heated the stubborn ones with an acetylene torch until they glowed cherry red, and beat on them with a 3-pound sledgehammer. My knuckles were skinned raw, my back ached with a fire I hadn't felt in years, and I was covered head to toe in a film of grime and burnt gear oil. Each evening, I'd come in long after dark, too tired to even wash up properly before collapsing at the kitchen table. And each day, I could hear the distant, steady hum of Rich's new tractors working in the fields surrounding mine. They worked late into the night, their bright halogen lights cutting across the horizon, a constant glowing reminder of how far behind I was falling. The talk at the co-op was brutal. I went in one afternoon to pick up some oil filters and heard them before they saw me. Heard Jed Stone's big bud finally blew up. Serves him right. Stubborn old fool. Should have traded that relic in years ago. Rich Davies will have his whole farm planted before Jed gets a single seed in the ground. Might be a good time to ask the bank about buying that north quarter of his when he goes under. I stepped around the aisle, my face a hard mask. The men, all neighbors I'd known my whole life, fell silent. They had the decency to look ashamed, but the words were already out there. They'd already written me off. I didn't say a word. I just paid for my filters and left, their judgment following me out the door like a cold shadow. That night, fueled by black coffee and pure, unadulterated stubbornness, I finally got the transmission out. It sat on the concrete floor like a slain beast, its guts waiting to be exposed. The rebuild kit arrived a week and a half after the breakdown. I spent another 4 days meticulously cleaning every gear, replacing every bearing and seal, following the worn, grease-stained pages of a service manual I'd sent away for. It was slow, painstaking work, but I knew every part of that machine, and slowly, piece by piece, it came back together. Finally, the day came. Using a hydraulic jack and a series of wooden blocks, I wrestled the rebuilt transmission back into the tractor's frame. Bolting it up was even harder than taking it out, but after 2 full days of heaving and straining, it was in. I filled it with fresh, clean gear oil, connected the drive shafts, and climbed into the cab. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The big Cummins coughed, then roared to life. I let it warm up, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed in the clutch, which felt smoother than before, and slid the gearshift into first. It went in with a solid, satisfying clunk. No whine, no grinding, just the quiet, confident sound of well-meshed gears. I got my crop in. I was 2.5 weeks late, but it was in. The community had watched me struggle, and they had mistaken my independence for weakness. They saw my old iron and my calloused hands as signs of failure. But as I worked those fields, long into the night, the steady, throbbing rhythm of my paid-for tractor was a declaration. I wasn't a dinosaur. I was a survivor. The late 70s were a fool's paradise. The government was screaming at us to plant fence row to fence row, to feed the world, and grain prices reflected it. Corn was over $3 a bushel. Beans were pushing $7. Land that my father bought for $200 an acre was now being appraised at $2,000, then $2,500. It felt like the good times would never end. That first harvest after the transmission rebuild, my late-planted crops did better than anyone expected. A wet August had helped them catch up. It wasn't a record year for me, but it was a solid, profitable one. I took the money, paid my property taxes, restocked my parts inventory, and put the rest, a tidy sum of about $40,000, into a certificate of deposit at the Farmers and Merchants Bank downtown. Mr. Harris, the bank president, called me into his office when I made the deposit. He was a man whose stomach had grown in direct proportion to the nation's money supply. He leaned back in his big leather chair, a portrait of confident prosperity. "Jedediah," he said, steepling his fingers. 5.5% interest is fine for a widow, but you're a businessman, a farmer. That money isn't working for you sitting here. "It's not costing me anything either," I replied. "But think of the opportunity cost," he boomed, leaning forward. "Rich Davies was just in here last week. He used his harvest profit and his land equity to finance the purchase of the old McGregor section. Another full section, Jed. At this rate, he'll be the biggest operator in the state. You have equity. Your land is free and clear. We could lend you enough to double your acreage tomorrow. Land values are only going up. It's a can't-lose proposition." "There's no such thing as a can't-lose proposition, Mr. Harris," I said, standing up. My father lost his farm in '33 on a can't-lose proposition. He sighed, a look of pity on his face. "This isn't the Depression, Jed. This is the modern era. You have to be aggressive to stay in the game." I just nodded and left. As I walked out, I passed Rich Davies in the lobby. He was dressed up, heading into a meeting with Harris. He grinned at me. "Closing on another farm, Jed. You ought to try it sometime. They're practically giving the land away." What he meant was, the bank was giving the money away, and he was taking every dollar they'd offer. Over the next 2 years, from '79 into '80, Rich became a local legend. He bought 2 more brand new John Deere 8640, articulated 4-wheel drives, the kind with 8 giant tires and a hinge in the middle. He built a new machine shed that was bigger than the high school gymnasium, with heated floors and electric doors. He bought a new Cadillac for his wife and a new Ford Bronco for himself. The local paper did a full-page story on him, calling him a pioneer of agribusiness. In the article, he talked about expansion, efficiency, and leveraging assets. My name never came up, but I felt like a ghost haunting his success story, the cautionary tale of the man who was too afraid to take a risk. The whispers in town grew louder. I was no longer just stubborn. I was a fool. I was letting the golden age of agriculture pass me by. While Rich was building an empire, I was still driving my old Ford pickup, still greasing the Zerks on my 4020, still patching the rust on the fenders of the Big Bud. I did have one good year, and I used the cash to buy an 80-acre parcel that bordered my property. I paid cash. The seller was an old widow who wanted a simple transaction, and she was happy to sell to me. It felt good, but in the shadow of Rich's massive expansion, it felt like a pittance. I was seen as a failure, a man stuck in the past, unable or unwilling to adapt. The scorn wasn't always spoken aloud, but I saw it in the eyes of the other farmers at the co-op, in the way the banker looked at me, in the tone of Rich's voice whenever he deigned to speak to me. They were all on a high-speed train to prosperity, and I was standing still on the platform. One evening in the late fall of 1980, I was in my workshop, rebuilding the carburetor on my old grain truck. The radio was on, tuned to the station out of Des Moines. The farm report was over, and the national news came on. They were talking about the economy, about something called stagflation. I didn't understand all the financial jargon, but I understood the words runaway inflation. Then the announcer mentioned the man in charge of the Federal Reserve, a fellow named Paul Volcker. He said Volcker was determined to break inflation's back, no matter the cost. As a final note, he mentioned that the prime lending rate, the interest rate banks charge their best customers, had just been raised again. It had just crossed 18% and was still climbing. A cold dread washed over me, colder than the November wind rattling the windows of the shed. 18%. The loans Rich had taken out, the ones Mr. Harris was so proud of, were almost all variable rate loans. I looked out the dusty window, across my dark, paid-for fields, toward the massive, brightly lit machine shed on Rich Davies's farm. It looked like a palace, a monument to modern progress. But I knew it was really a cathedral of debt, and the high priests in Washington had just changed the religion. The air felt different, heavy with a coming storm that only a man with no debt could smell. That winter of 1980 bled into a spring of gnawing anxiety. The 20% interest rates weren't just a headline on the radio anymore. They were a cancer eating away at the heart of the country. At the co-op, the casual talk of crop prices and new equipment was replaced by hushed, worried conversations about operating notes and loan extensions. Men who had walked with a swagger a year ago now walked with their shoulders stooped, their eyes fixed on the ground. The first real sign of the coming earthquake was the grain embargo. The government, in a grand political gesture against the Soviets, cut off our biggest customer. The bottom fell out of the market overnight. Corn that was supposed to bring $3.50 a bushel was lucky to fetch $2. It was a catastrophic blow, but it was only the beginning. Nature, as if in league with the bankers, decided to twist the knife. The spring rains never came. April was dry and windy, stealing the moisture from the topsoil. May was the same. I planted my corn and beans into dust, the old John Deere 4020 kicking up clouds that you could see for miles. I had to set the planter discs deeper than I liked, chasing the last hint of dampness in the soil. Every morning I'd wake up and scan the western horizon, praying for a line of thunderheads, and every morning I was met with a pale, mercilessly clear sky. My crops struggled, sprouting thin and pale, but they sprouted. I cultivated them twice with the 40-20, carefully throwing what little dirt I could over their roots to conserve moisture, a trick my father had used in the 50s. It was slow, tedious work under the relentless sun, but it kept the weeds down and the ground from baking into a solid brick. Rich Davies's operation was a different story. His new, heavy tractors compacted the dry soil with every pass. His philosophy was built on big inputs, more fertilizer, more herbicide, more everything. But without water, the expensive fertilizer just sat in the ground, burning and the young roots. The chemical weed killers needed rain to activate, so his fields, particularly the newly acquired, heavily mortgaged sections, became choked with foxtail and water hemp, fierce competitors for what little moisture there was. The real trouble started for him in June. I was out on my tractor, the familiar rumble of the side console diesel, a comforting sound in the quiet desolation, when I saw one of his new John Deere 8640s stopped dead in the middle of a field. A day later, the dealer's service truck was out there. I heard the story from one of the mechanics when I went into town for filters. A catastrophic failure in the articulated steering's hydraulic manifold. It wasn't a simple fix of replacing a hose or a valve. It was a complex, integrated component that had to be special ordered from the factory in Waterloo. The tractor sat in that field for 10 days, a monument to progress paralyzed by its own complexity, while the weeds grew around its giant tires. The repair bill, I later heard, was over $8,000. $8,000 he had to borrow at 21% interest just to fix a machine he was already paying a fortune for. The cracks in his empire began to show. The new Cadillac his wife drove was quietly traded for a used Chevy sedan. The Bronco disappeared. He started working with a frantic, desperate energy, staying in the fields until well after midnight, the lights of his machines sweeping across the blighted landscape like searchlights looking for a sign of hope. But there was none to be found. The corn began to tassel when it was only waist-high, a sure sign of a stunted, pathetic yield. One afternoon, I saw Rich himself out on a tractor, something I hadn't seen in years. He was driving the Steiger, pulling a massive field cultivator, trying to tear out a section of beans that had failed to germinate and replant it with sorghum, a drought-tolerant feed crop. He was enveloped in a massive cloud of brown dust, a man literally turning his own farm into a desert. As I watched from my fence row, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a profound sadness. He had mistaken the bank's money for his own genius, and the bill for that education was coming due. The whole county was holding its breath, waiting for the harvest, waiting for the final reckoning. We all knew it was going to be a bloodbath. The harvest of 1981 was less a harvest and more of a salvage operation. My corn averaged about 70 bushels to the acre, less than half of what it should have been. But it was something. My beans were even worse. Still, because my costs were so low, I'd break even. I wouldn't be putting any money in the bank, but I wouldn't be taking any out either. In that economy, breaking even was a stunning victory. For Rich Davies, it was the end. His yields were catastrophic. Some of his cornfields didn't even produce 50 bushels. The bank, which had once courted him like a movie star, was now his jailer. His operating note was due, and the payments on his land and machinery were piling up like snowdrifts. Mr. Harris was no longer smiling. The FDIC was breathing down his neck, and the friendly, back-slapping community banker was replaced by a cold-eyed accountant whose only concern was the bottom line. Foreclosure notices began to appear in the county paper like obituaries. First, it was the smaller guys, the young farmers who had just gotten started, leveraged to the hilt. Then, the bigger names started to appear. The community was in a state of shock. These were families who had farmed this land for 100 years, being wiped out by a combination of bad weather, bad policy, and the siren song of easy credit. Rich fought it. He tried to sell off some of his new equipment, but the market was flooded. A 2-year-old combine that he'd paid $150,000 for wouldn't bring 50. Everyone was selling. No one was buying. He tried to sell a section of land, but land values had collapsed even faster than they had risen. The $2,000 an acre ground he'd bought was now worth maybe $800, while the loan on it was still for the full amount. He was trapped, upside down, in a world he had thought he mastered. My season, meanwhile, was one of quiet routine. After my meager harvest was in the bin, I pulled the big bud into the shed. It needed work. The drought had been hard on it too. The fine dust had gotten into everything. I spent a week just cleaning the air filters and changing the oil. Then I started my winter maintenance. I pulled the injectors from the big Cummins, cleaning and testing each one. I greased every fitting, checked the tension on every belt, and walked every inch of the frame, looking for stress cracks. My hands, stained with the permanent grime of grease and diesel, moved with the familiarity of a surgeon. This machine wasn't just a tool, it was a partner. I knew its every sound, its every vibration. While the world outside my shed was collapsing, in here there was order, logic, and the quiet satisfaction of self-reliance. The final notice for the Davies Farm auction was posted on the door of the post office in early March of 1982. It was a cold, grey day, the kind that saps all the hope out of you. The auction was to be held on his farmstead, in the shadow of the magnificent empty machine shed he had built. It felt like a public execution. I survived because I owed nothing. The interest rate could have been 100%, and it wouldn't have mattered to my balance sheet. The drought hurt, but it didn't kill me because I wasn't feeding a bank beast along with my family. My old, paid-for machines became my salvation. When a hydraulic line on the 40/20 burst, I drove to town, paid $20 for a new one, and had it fixed in an hour. When the alternator on the big bud failed, I took it off, drove to the salvage yard, and bought a used one for $50. I didn't need a dealer. I didn't need a loan. All I needed was my tools, my knowledge, and my two hands. The very things Rich and the bankers had called obsolete were the things that ensured my survival. I was a dinosaur, all right, and I had just watched the meteor fall, and I was still standing. The day of the Davies auction was bitter, with a wind that cut right through your coat. The sky was the color of lead. It felt like the whole county was there, not out of spectacle, but out of a grim sense of solidarity. Like townspeople gathering to watch a hanging, they were powerless to stop. The auctioneer's truck was parked in front of the massive machine shed. Its doors slid wide open to reveal the fleet of machinery that had been Rich's pride and joy. The gleaming green and yellow paint seemed to mock the somber mood. I saw Mr. Harris, the banker, standing off to the side, looking uncomfortable in his expensive overcoat. He wasn't smiling. He looked like a man who had just shot his own prize-winning horse. The men who had once slapped Rich on the back and praised his business acumen now stood in small, quiet groups, avoiding his gaze. Rich was there, standing beside his wife. He looked 10 years older. The confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. He had lost everything: the land, the equipment, the house. He was wearing a simple work coat and worn boots, no longer the picture of the progressive farmer, but just another man broken by the unforgiving calculus of agriculture. I didn't go there to gloat. I went there to bear witness. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands in my pockets, just watching. The auctioneer started with the small items: tools, shop equipment, fuel tanks. Then he moved to the tractors. The magnificent 8640s, barely 3 years old, sold for less than a third of what Rich had paid for them. The big 720 combine went for a pittance to an outfit from another state. It was a slaughter. When they got to the Steiger Panther thread, the machine that had been the symbol of his arrival, a hush fell over the crowd. It was the tractor he had driven to the Miller auction all those years ago to mock me. The bidding was slow, pathetic. No one had the money or the credit for a machine that big. The auctioneer chanted, I got $40,000. Who'll give me 41? $40,000 for a practically new tractor. Boys? Silence. Come on, folks, this machine's worth twice that. More silence. The auctioneer looked around, frustrated. All right, I'll take 38. Do I hear 38? On an impulse I didn't fully understand, I raised my hand. 38,000 from Jed Stone, the auctioneer boomed, a little surprised. Now we're moving. Who'll give me 39? No one did. The hammer fell. Sold to Jedediah Stone for $38,000. A murmur went through the crowd. I had just bought my rival's flagship tractor. I didn't need it. The Big Bud was a better, simpler machine in my mind, but I knew why I'd done it. After the machinery was sold, they auctioned the land. It was broken up into parcels. I watched as the Henderson place, the first 800 acres Rich had bought with such pride, went on the block. A corporate farm from Illinois bought it. Then they put his home quarter up, the original Davies family farmstead that his grandfather had homesteaded. The bidding stalled at a criminally low price. Rich's wife began to sob quietly, her husband's arm around her. I couldn't watch any more. I walked over to where Rich was standing. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and defeat. He probably thought I was there to rub it in. "Rich," I said, my voice low. He just nodded, unable to speak. "I'm sorry," I said. It was all I could think of to say. He finally looked at me, really looked at me. "You were right, Jed," he whispered, his voice cracking. You told me about the bank. I thought you were a fool." "You weren't a fool, Rich," I said. "You just listened to the wrong people. We all did. You just bet bigger than the rest of us." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my checkbook. I wrote a check and handed it to him. It was for $5,000. He stared at it. "What's this?" "For the Steiger," I said. "The auction company will take their commission, and the rest will go to the bank. This is for you, for your family, to get you started again somewhere." He tried to hand it back. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can," I said firmly. "You're a good farmer, Rich. You just got caught in a bad time. Take it. Go somewhere and start over. A smaller place. Pay cash this time." Tears welled up in his eyes. He took the check and crushed it in his fist. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a single, convulsive gesture of gratitude and despair. I clapped him on the shoulder, the same gesture he had used on me years ago. But this time it wasn't a shove. It was a support. Then I walked away. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis of the 80s changed everything. The get-rich-quick mentality was gone, replaced by a hard-won caution. The community, humbled and thinned out, rediscovered the virtues of thrift and cooperation. The men who had once mocked my old machinery now came to me for help, asking how to rebuild a water pump or set the timing on an old diesel. My workshop became a kind of community center, a place where knowledge was shared freely and neighbors helped neighbors keep their old iron running. I never charged a dime. I kept the Steiger. I parked it in the back of my machine shed and never once started it. It sat there as a reminder, a big, green, expensive reminder of how quickly fortunes can turn and how dangerous it is to believe your own hype. My son, John, grew up in the shadow of that crisis. He never knew the heady days of the 70s, only the hard-won recovery. He learned to farm at my side, not in a classroom. I taught him how to weld, how to overhaul an engine, how to listen to the land instead of the bankers. He learned the value of $1 because he saw how many hours of sweat and grease went into earning one. One warm summer evening, years later, when John was a young man, we were standing by the Big Bud. It was old now, truly a relic, its paint faded to a chalky white, its chrome stack pitted and scarred. But it had a dignity that no new machine could match. It was a survivor, just like us. "Dad," John said, running his hand over the massive fender, "why did you buy Rich Davies's tractor that day? You never even used it." I looked at him. My son, the future of this farm, this land. "I bought it," I said slowly, "so I would never forget. Prosperity can make a man deaf. He stops listening to the engine, stops listening to the soil, stops listening to the old men who've seen it all before. That tractor is there to remind me to always listen." I put my arm around his shoulders. "This land, this farm, it's not just a business, son. It's a trust. Your great-grandfather passed it to my father, and my father passed it to me. And someday I'll pass it to you. But we don't really own it. We're just caretakers. And our first job as caretakers is to never, ever bet the farm. You own what you work, and you work what you own. You remember that, and this land will take care of you, just like it's taken care of us." He nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. In the distance, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields of corn and beans, fields that were ours, free and clear. I turned the key on the big bud. The old Cummins engine turned over, coughed a plume of black smoke, and then settled into that deep, rumbling idle that had been the soundtrack of my life. It was the sound of power, of resilience, of a legacy secured not with debt, but with wisdom. It was the sound of survival.